At a few minutes past 10 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander McClusky looked down from 14,000 feet and saw 4 Japanese aircraft carriers cutting white wakes across a smooth Pacific Sea. He had 33 dive bombers behind him, most of them past the point of safe fuel. Within half an hour, 3 of those carriers would be burning from bow to stern, and the balance of the Pacific War would tip and never tip back. 6 months earlier, those same carriers had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Since then, the first air fleet, the Kido Butai, had ranged from Hawaii to Ceylon without losing a ship. In the spring of 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aimed it at a tiny atoll, 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, Midway. The plan was to seize the island and use it as bait, drawing the surviving American carriers into a decisive battle where they would be destroyed. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would lead 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryu, with some 248 aircraft. Yamamoto himself would trail hundreds of miles behind with the battleships, under radio silence. The plan assumed surprise. There was none. At Pearl Harbor, a team of codebreakers under Commander Joseph Rochefort had been reading fragments of the Japanese fleet code JN-25. The intercepts kept pointing at a target designated only as AF. To prove AF was Midway, the Americans had the island radio in the clear that its water distillation plant had broken down. Within about 2 days, a Japanese transmission reported that AF was short of fresh water. That settled it. On May 27th, intelligence officer Edwin Layton told Admiral Chester Nimitz the Japanese carriers would strike on the morning of June 4th from the northwest, about 175 miles out. He would turn out to be off by 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles. Nimitz had 3 carriers to meet them. Enterprise and Hornet sailed under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser commander with no aviation background, standing in for Bill Halsey, who was in the hospital with a skin disease. The 3rd carrier, Yorktown, had been bombed at the Coral Sea a month before. She limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, went straight into dry dock, and sailed again on May 30th. Welders still aboard, patched together in 3 days. Nimitz's written instruction to his commanders came down to one phrase: the principle of calculated risk. Do not expose your force unless the damage you can inflict is greater than the damage you might take. Nagumo knew none of this. The reconnaissance flight meant to check whether the American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor had been canceled at the end of May. The submarine picket lines meant to catch them sortying arrived on station late, after the Americans had already passed. Nagumo steamed toward Midway, believing the enemy carriers were 4,000 miles away. Almost everything known about what happened next comes from the paperwork, the American action reports, and the Japanese carriers' own flight operations logs, which rewrote the story when researchers finally worked through them in the 1990s. Records like those are what Warshelf is built from, a library of short books on the Second World War, one closed story per volume, each one read down out of roughly 10,000 pages of documents. The link is in the description. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, 108 Japanese aircraft lifted off to strike Midway, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga of the Hiryu. Nagumo held back a second wave, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case enemy ships appeared. At about 7 o'clock, Tomonaga radioed that a second attack on the island was needed. 15 minutes later, Nagumo gave the order that would haunt the rest of the morning: strike the torpedoes below, rearm the reserve aircraft with land bombs for Midway. At 7:28, a float plane from the cruiser Tone, launched half an hour late because of catapult trouble, reported 10 enemy surface ships to the northeast. For the better part of an hour, the report stayed vague. Cruisers and destroyers, it said. Then, at 8:20, a correction. The enemy appears to be accompanied by a carrier. Aboard Akagi, the arithmetic turned ugly. Down in the hangars, aircraft sat in mid-rearmament, torpedoes coming off, bombs going on, and now the order reversed again. From Hiryu, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi flashed a blinker signal. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Nagumo declined. Tomonaga's Midway strike was circling overhead, low on fuel. Some aircraft shot up, and Japanese Doctrine called for one-mast, coordinated blow, not a piecemeal launch. Between 8:37 and 9:18, he recovered his aircraft. At 9:17, he turned northeast toward the Americans, worked up speed, and planned to launch a full strike at about 10:30. He never got the chance, because for the next hour, the Americans never left him alone. They came in pieces because the American attack had fallen apart in the air. Hornet's dive bombers and all of her fighters flew a heading that found nothing but empty ocean. Her 10 escorting Wildcats ditched, one after another, out of fuel. But her torpedo squadron, 15 slow, obsolete devastators under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had broken away from the group and flown straight to the enemy. At about 9:20, they attacked without a single fighter covering them. All 15 were shot down. Of 30 men, one survived, Ensign George Gay, floating in the water under a seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle from sea level. At 10 o'clock, 14 devastators from Enterprise attacked Kaga. Their commander, Eugene Lindsay, was killed, and most of his squadron went into the sea. Minutes later, 12 more from Yorktown came in under Lance Massey, who died with most of his. 41 torpedo bombers had launched from the 3 American carriers that morning. 4 came back. Not one torpedo hit anything. But the slaughter had consequences no one planned. For over an hour, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been dragged down to wave height, chasing torpedo planes, burning fuel and ammunition. The carriers had no radar and no fighter direction. Each section of Zeros chose its own targets, and every one of them chose low. And the constant attacks kept Nagumo's ships heeling through evasive turns, unable to pause and launch anything. Far above, Wade McClusky's fuel problem was becoming a crisis. Enterprise's dive bombers had reached the predicted intercept point and found nothing. Instead of turning home, McClusky pressed the search. At about 9:55, he spotted a single Japanese destroyer far below, running north at full speed, dragging a white arrow of wake across the sea. It was the Arashi, late to rejoin the fleet because she had stayed behind to depth charge an American submarine, the Nautilus. McClusky followed her. 10 minutes later, the entire Kido Butai lay spread out beneath him. And at almost the same moment, by pure coincidence, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown under Maxwell Leslie arrived from the southeast. 2 carriers worth of dive bombers, converging unplanned on a fleet whose fighters were all at sea level. The dives began at about 10:22. Kaga was first. Most of McClusky's bombers came down on her at 70 degrees, and at least 4 bombs went through her flight deck. One wiped out the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his staff. Fires took hold in the hangars almost instantly, and never stopped. Sōryū was next, minutes later. Leslie's squadron put 3 bombs into her, forward, amidships, aft. Leslie himself led the attack with nothing under his aircraft. A faulty arming switch had dropped his bomb into the sea on the way out. It made no difference. Sōryū's steam lines ruptured. She coasted to a stop, and the order to abandon ship came within about half an hour. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was attacked by just 3 aircraft, a section led by Lieutenant Richard Best that peeled away from the Kaga attack at the last moment. 1 bomb hit near the amidships elevator. 1. It punched through and burst in the hangar deck. 1 bomb killed a fleet carrier. And the reason is the heart of this story. Japanese Doctrine armed and fueled aircraft below in enclosed hangars, bringing them up only just before launch. On this morning, those hangars held a full strike in mid-rearmament, and around the aircraft lay the ordnance stripped off during Nagumo's reversals, torpedoes and heavy bombs stacked on the deck instead of struck down to the magazines. Best's bomb went off inside a sealed box packed with aviation, gasoline, and live ordnance. Nothing on Earth could put those fires out. For 50 years, the world told this story differently. Mitsuo Fuchida, who was aboard Akagi that morning, wrote after the war that the Japanese strike was spotted on deck, engines turning, 5 minutes from launch, when the American bombers appeared. 5 fateful minutes from victory. It was a magnificent story, and Akagi's own operations log proves it false. The log records her landing combat air patrol fighters at 12 minutes before the attack. A deck landing fighters cannot hold a spotted strike. The strike was still below, and bringing it up, arming, spotting, and launching would have taken the better part of 45 minutes. The proof is Hiryu, steaming apart from the others and untouched, the readiest ship in the fleet. With her 3 sisters burning in front of her and every procedure abandoned, she still needed until nearly 11 o'clock to get her counterstrike into the air. The 6 minutes were real. The near miss was not. The Japanese were never 5 minutes from anything. Hiryu fought the rest of the day alone. Her dive bombers found Yorktown at noon and put 3 bombs into her. Her torpedo planes came back in the afternoon, led by Tominaga, who took off, knowing his hold fuel tank meant he could not return, and put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's side. She listed 23 degrees and was abandoned. But at 5:03 that evening, American dive bombers found Hiryu and hit her 4 times. She burned through the night. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, the man who had urged Nagumo to launch immediately, refused to leave her and went down with the ship. By the morning of June 5th, all 4 carriers were gone. Sōryū and Kaga sank on the evening of the 4th, taking more than 1,500 men between them. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stayed on Sōryū's signal platform to the end. Akagi was scuttled by her own destroyers before dawn. Yorktown, under salvage and moving under tow, was torpedoed by the submarine I-168 on June 6th and sank at first light on the 7th, along with the destroyer Haman, which went down alongside her in 4 minutes. The final ledger: Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men. The United States lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and just over 300. Did 6 minutes cost Japan the war? Not by themselves. The war ran 3 more years. Japan still had carriers, and her airmen mostly survived Midway. The loss that could not be replaced was the mechanics, armorers, and deck crews who went down with the ships. What the 6 minutes ended was the Japanese offensive. The planned drive against Fiji and Samoa was postponed within a week and canceled within a month. And 2 months after Midway, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal. The initiative changed hands on the morning of June 4th and never changed back. And behind it stood arithmetic no battle could fix. In 1942 alone, the United States built 47,000 aircraft. Japan built under 9,000. The men scattered. Nagumo was moved to shore commands and shot himself on Saipan in 1944. Yamamoto was ambushed and killed over Bougainville in April 1943. His flight schedule read from the same broken code that had set the trap at Midway. Richard Best, whose 1 bomb destroyed Akagi, inhaled caustic fumes from a faulty oxygen system during the battle, coughed blood that night, and never flew again. Fuchida survived his burning ship with 2 broken ankles and spent decades as the West's favorite witness, until the logs caught up with him. George Gay, the man in the water, lived until 1994. When he died, his ashes were carried out and scattered on the sea off Midway, over the spot where the other 29 men of Torpedo 8 had gone in ahead of him on the morning the war turned.